Okay, hello everybody. Thank you for joining us one more time. Today we are in the company of Dr. John Gray, who I will introduce now. Dr. John Gray is a professor in applied linguistics. He holds a degree in English from Trinity College, Dublin, and a master's degree and a PhD from the Institute of Education, London. His background is in English language teaching and English language teacher education. He's the author of Critical Perspectives on Language Teaching Materials, of Neoliberalism and Applied Linguistics, along with David Block and Marnie Holbrook, and Social Interaction and English Language Teacher Identity, written with Tom Morton, and also of many contributions to different journals. His research interests are in the global spread of English, with a particular focus on the promotion and marketization of English and other languages in late modernity, the ways in which neoliberal ideology plays out in language teaching and language teacher education, language teacher identity, and issues of gender and sexuality in language teaching and beyond. We are so happy to be talking to Dr. John Gray today. As we told him, both of us have the greatest respect for him and his work. So thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thank you both very much thank you for that very kind introduction. Thank you for inviting me to talk, and thanks for everyone who's going to be listening to our conversation. It's a real honor to be speaking to Argentinian teachers.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for being here with us today. Okay, we'd like to start by asking you about representation and erasure of LGBTQ identities, because you have written extensively about this, and because it will also be the unifying thread, yes, in our talk. You have argued that a lot has been said about this, but little has been done. What do you think the reasons for this are?
Well, I think the reasons are really quite complicated. I think when we look at the situation globally, I mean, what we see is that in many parts of the global north, for example, there's, as you say, rightly, protective legislation, yeah? And of course, in other parts of the world, there isn't such legislation at all. And in other parts of the world, it's very problematic or dangerous to be LGBTQ. So there's no way that representation could be even considered, for example, in some of these places. I think in settings in the global north, I think the reasons are extremely complex, really, to be quite honest with you. I think erasure is part and parcel of many educational systems anyway. And I think it's not just about LGBT, it's about all kinds of groups of people who are, for various reasons, sometimes ideological reasons, edited out of the story. For example, I was just talking to someone, I mean, at the moment with Black Lives Matter being such a big thing in many parts of the Anglophone world, certainly. I mean, one of the things that people have been talking about in the UK is the erasure, for example, when we look at the teaching of history, yeah, in schools in the UK. And what you find in the teaching of history, for example, is an editing out or a non-addressing of, for example, imperialism, the long history of British imperialism, and the editing out of the story of Britain's, you know, empire of, for example, those who are on the receiving end of such a thing, yeah? So the lived experiences of the colonized are not part of the story. So erasure is all over the place. It's in many subject areas. If we even look at the achievements of women in so many domains, like art history, the teaching of music, anything, I mean, women are often edited out of the story. So erasure is something that is pervasive. And of course, it also applies to LGBTQ people as well. And that's what we're talking about here and we're interested in. I mean, I think things that happen in like on the ground, let's say in educational settings, often lag behind legislative reform. mean, if you look at the UK, I mean, the 1967 Act it decriminalizes homosexuality. Yeah. But of course, it takes years, it takes decades for educational systems to catch up with that. And of course, people are also scared of getting things wrong. So they think, well, maybe we've got the legislation is there, the legislation protects, that's enough. We don't really need to do anything else. Yeah. Of course, we know that we do need to do something else, because legislation is the protection after perhaps something has happened. I think what we need to do is to change the way people think and feel and do things. Yeah. So I think there's this caution on the one hand. I think also when we look at powerful industries like English language teaching and the way in which, for example, British ELT, which has been so significant in the dissemination of ideas about how to do teaching and what to teach and content, etc. I mean, that powerful industry has been very averse to addressing this issue. And I would say largely for commercial reasons. The materials, the products that are produced and sold for the global market are sold into very conservative markets. And in a way that also then impacts on more, if you like, liberal markets as well, that these products are deemed suitable for everybody. So I think there are financial considerations. I think there's the whole issue of caution and just a general unwillingness to address it, you know. So that's why I think we're in the situation that we're in, you know.
Yes. Last year, in your plenary talk at IATEFL, this plenary talk was entitled Gender and Sexuality in ELT, Inclusive Education versus Queer Pedagogy.
Yeah.
Can you define both inclusive education and queer pedagogy? And could you also tell us why you decided to put it in terms of one versus the other?
Okay. I mean, that was something that I thought a lot about, actually. I think inclusive education is quite straightforward in many ways. Inclusive education is about including those who have been erased. Yeah. So I think we can understand what we're talking about here. We can understand the notion of including the working class. We can understand the including of the colonized, the including of ethnic minorities, or the including of sexual and gender minorities. So it's about a bringing in those who've been on the outside. At the same time, and that's a good thing. I'm not in any way critiquing that. I think that's what we have to do. And in fact, there isn't a clear conflict between inclusive education and queer pedagogy. That said, queer pedagogy, I think, has a slightly different aim. If you think about inclusive education as a bringing in, queer pedagogy is much more about an attempt to change things at a much more fundamental level. Yeah, it has a more radical agenda, which is profoundly political, and it seeks, I suppose, to unpick perhaps things like heteronormativity. I mean, I was looking at a book that some of you might know by José Esteban Muñoz, who is unfortunately no longer with us, a Mexican scholar, and he's talking about queer, and he says it is essentially about a rejection of the here and now, and an insistence on potentiality or concrete possibility for another world. So in other words, it's about wanting to create a new kind of world and the role that education might have in the creation of a new world, rather than simply a bringing in of those who were excluded. Now, of course, that's a bit like a Venn diagram. I mean, these are like overlapping circles. They're different, but there are points of contact. Yeah.
It's like queer pedagogy goes beyond somehow.
Exactly. And I suppose as well, Paula, one of the things that I was worried about was that when I started teaching in the 1980s in Spain, and the materials that we used were all produced in the UK, but they were extremely sexist. I mean, they were full of stories about women that, you know, were doing their driving test and they'd done it for, you know, 25 times and they still hadn't passed, or, you know, women who were always featured in the home as housewives while it was the men who were doing the interesting jobs, etc. So a lot of us felt very uncomfortable as young teachers working with material that was very, very sexist. Yeah. And there was a huge campaign on the part of teachers petitioning the, you know, the publishers to make material that was more inclusive, i.e. that represented women in a more realistic way and didn't confine them simply to the kitchen. Now, that campaigning paid off. It was hugely, it had a big impact on publishing. However, the result was also equally, it seems to me, problematic. If you now looked at a book produced in the UK for the global market, it would be full of these career women who have husbands, they've got families, they've got high-powered jobs, they've got everything. And this is all presented as lifestyle choice. In other words, the whole issue of struggle, of having to fight for things, of ongoing sexism, of ongoing, you know, pay differentials, all of this is just edited out, and it looks like these are these women, they've chosen to do this, and you too can do it. Well, it's not that straightforward. So I suppose what I was trying to do was say, we don't necessarily want to confine ourselves when it comes to LGBT stuff to think about, oh, let's just have a load of LGBT people in our textbooks and that'll make it all okay, because it may not. Yeah. So I suppose I was trying to just set up a little bit of a tension there, even though at the same time I'm suggesting there's a huge amount of overlap. Does that clarify it a bit?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good. In this talk that Pao mentioned, and in some of your papers, you mentioned heteronorms.
Yeah.
Can you tell us what this refers to and their relationship with the ELT world?
Well, I suppose heteronorms really would refer to the norms that we associate with heterosexuality or compulsory heterosexuality, as it's sometimes called. I mean, you know, the idea that women necessarily always desire men, that men desire women, that heterosexuality is the default setting for all human sexual orientation, that masculine and feminine roles, for example, are largely innate, that women are natural caregivers, for example, and that there's a clear male-female gender binary. Yeah, so you're either completely male or you're either completely female, and there's no gray area or anything in between or other ways of more fluidic ways of being. And I suppose also that all of this can be policed actively by everybody, yeah? So that you're constantly having to think about how you present, because you could be critiqued for that if you didn't conform to these norms. And I think a lot of this stuff is kind of it's just there. It's, you know, people are doing it almost without thinking. I mean, I was on the train recently, and I was trying to read a book, and there were two families sitting near me, and the women were talking, and they both had small children, and one little boy was behaving extremely badly, yeah, and he was in the aisle on the train, and he was kicking the seats, you know, in a really sort of aggressive way, and one woman said to the other one, he's all boy. Yeah, in other words, like, this is normal. This is completely, he's doing this because he's a boy, rather than because
boys.
Claro, it's expected.
Yeah.
So in a way, I suppose heteronormativity or the critique of heteronormativity is about, I suppose, these ideas that these are innate ways for men and women to behave. This is what boys are like. This is what girls are like. And then, you know, so that kind of thing, I suppose those are what we mean by heteronorms, the norms associated with the regime of compulsory heterosexuality, I suppose. Yeah.
Yes, and you also spoke about homonormativity, which is related to the following question. somehow.
Okay.
In one of your papers, you describe an analysis that you made of some contemporary popular course books. And in this particular paper, you also claim that when the LGBTQ community is indeed represented, they usually fall into the category of the good gays.
Yeah.
So our question is, what does being a good gay involve, and how this relates to homonormativity?
Yeah. I mean, some people after I mentioned that in the 𝑖𝑑𝑒𝑒𝑒 talk, challenged me and said, "But come on, John, you got to loosen up here. Some good gays might be better than no gays at all. I suppose what I was trying to do there, I mean, one of the things that I've been really concerned about in my work is the effect that neoliberalism has had on education. Yeah. Neoliberalism is I suppose what I mean by neoliberalism is the current model of capitalism that we're all having to live with. Yeah. And across much of the world. Yeah. Certainly in the UK, it dates from the first Thatcher government in 1979. And we're still living with the consequences of that today. The Americans had it under Reagan. It was imposed on Chile after the downfall of Allende, etc. So it's the kind of model that has at its heart this idea of the individual. The individual is what it's all about. Thatcher famously said there's no such thing as society. There are only individual men and women and families. Yeah. Now that idea is deeply pernicious. Yeah. And it seems to me that the idea of the neoliberal citizen is a person who is highly responsible for themselves. So I, as a good neoliberal citizen, try and manage my life as though it's a kind of project. Yeah, I'm supposed to, my attitude to my life is that I am the CEO of my own life. Yeah, it's like a business and I run it. Yeah, so it's focused around, I suppose, domesticity. It's focused around consumption. I suppose also wise and appropriate consumption, and individualism. And the idea, we look at these, I suppose what I was talking about, these good gays are neoliberal citizens who are in stable relationships, who consume appropriately, and who may be adopting children and are actually just the same as everybody else. Yeah, the only thing that makes them different is that they happen to like people of the same sex. Yeah. And I suppose there's a very middle class and very white view of the LGBT person there that doesn't cover the whole picture. Not everybody fits into that model. What about queer Muslims? What about queer lesbians with a hijab living in Birmingham here today, having to listen to Islamophobic remarks in the media, and also maybe Islamophobic remarks coming from the LGBT community, and herself being a lesbian, feeling torn on the one hand with her Muslim identity pulling her in one way and her lesbian identity pulling her in another. So I think not everyone fits into this model of this good citizen who is middle class, is white, consumes in a sensible way, etc. Yeah.
The kind of person that
is, I suppose.
Yeah, the kind of person that doesn't make people uncomfortable.
Exactly. Yeah. You would be very happy for your son or your daughter to, if they were LGBT, to get married to one of them. Yeah.
Definitely.
Exactly. So this is related also with our next question, and it has to do with intersectionality. Okay, and this term was coined by Crenshaw in 1989, but has just recently migrated into everyday conversation. And you have also written about intersectionality. What kind of intersectionality are you making reference to in your papers?
Well, I suppose the intersectionality that's of most concern to me is would be class, for example, is something that I think is hugely important. I mean, I've written about the erasure of class in textbooks, for example, produced certainly in the UK for global dissemination. I mean, there's been, and again, that's something that I would associate with neoliberalism, the whole idea that we're all middle class now. Yeah, and that the working class can be seen as maybe the poor or in some kind of way, but there's that idea of not thinking about people as being part of a collective in any kind of way. So I think when we think about good gays, for example, good gays are most definitely something just popped up on my screen. Okay, fine. Yeah. Good gays are most definitely middle class. Yeah. So I think, you know, life is different for gay people who are perhaps members of religious communities. I mean, in Britain, you're probably not aware, but there was a huge campaign last year outside a primary school in Birmingham, where the head teacher had decided, in the light of the 2010 Equality Act, to bring in a kind of sensitization program towards different kinds of diversity, including gender and sexual diversity for children. It was all done in a very, very child-friendly way, but certain groups, religious groups, demonstrated very vociferously outside the school where this was happening. Now, those religious groups, well, I mean, in the media, this was covered mainly as right-wing Muslims demonstrating against progress. Yeah. But of course, there were at the same time, I mean, you know, in one of the newspapers here in the UK, there were interviews with queer Muslims from Birmingham talking about you know, how they felt about all of this, you know, and the way in which they felt demonized by the press. Because not all Muslims feel this way about things. Not all Christians feel the same about these things. So I think when we think about intersectionality, we need to think about a view of ourselves as having of being more complex, of our class identities, or possibly having a religious identity as well, and that these also need to be taken into consideration when we try and represent LGBTQ people more comprehensively. Yeah. I suppose that would seem to me to be an important thing.
Yes. We're familiar with those movements because the same happens here in Argentina. Yeah. And it has to do with the same thing. I mean, trying to introduce, for example, diversity in the classroom, and some religious groups complaining about it. But coming back to
religion, yes. Can I just say something
yes,
on religion? In 2013 to 2015, myself and Mel Cook, who works at King's College London, and Mike Bainham at the University of Leeds, we had a little seminar series called Queering Esau, and it ran over 2 years, and there were various themes that we explored. But one of the themes we explored was religion. And that was a kind of thing that we were, maybe all three of us were a little bit scared of, because people, like, none of us are religious ourselves, but that we were aware that very often there's a tension between people who purport to be religious and those who are members of sexual and gender minorities. But of course, one of the things that came out of that was that lots and lots of LGBTQ people are themselves members of religious communities, and have to negotiate their own, sometimes slightly uncomfortable membership of several different communities, and try to reconcile their religious identities with their gender or sexual identity. So it was hugely informative for us as well, to learn about that. and the need to think about that as well as educators, yeah, and not to simply miss people because they may have religious views.
Yeah, definitely. And coming back to this erasure we were talking about before, especially erasure of LGBTQ people, or this major silence in terms of their representation in materials, for example. Can you tell us which could be possible consequences of such erasure, especially in LGBTQ students?
That's a really good question, and it's one that I've been thinking about, because in the 𝑖𝑑𝑒𝑓𝑒 talk, I quoted from Andrew Sayer, who said that there were consequences. I don't think there's actually all that much research done on what it's like or what it feels like to be erased in that way. I think we can hypothesize. There is some evidence. I mean, for example, I quoted Pasaribu, the Indonesian poet, who talked about when he was young growing up and reading, about falling in love and things like that there, that these love stories always seem to involve boys and girls, yeah? And he said, when you don't see yourself on the page, it's harder to think of yourself as a person. So I think he was saying, look, we need to see people that we can identify with represented. And I think it makes sense, it makes sense. I think you can still imagine yourself as a person, even if you're not represented, but you might imagine yourself as a person that there was something wrong with, yeah? So, in certain stories that are told, or even, when you look at television programs, soap operas, etc., they're often, they're often ahead of the game in terms of including, transgender people or LGBT or, whatever, yeah? Certain kinds of people are often included, and that can be, it would appear that people often find these representations helpful and useful and agreeable, yeah? So I think that's it's an interesting area that there's probably not much research done in, but I think the suggestion is that those that are normally erased like it when they see representations that they can identify with, yeah? That said, of course, queers have always been good at finding people to identify with in films, in stories, in which there seems to be no queer content at all, yeah? So very often things can be read as queer that are not, that were not queer at the moment of creation. And I think teachers can do quite a lot there in encouraging queer readings of things that are not necessarily queer, yeah? And that can be useful as well, yeah.
Wow, so interesting. In your papers, you also speak about different teacher identities, namely the teacher as an effective practitioner or as a reflective practitioner, and how these two identities may align or not with what 𝑊ℎ𝑎𝑡'𝑠 considers the aim of teaching, which is to enable our students to live fully in the world. Yeah. Can you enlarge a bit on this and make a distinction between teacher as an effective practitioner and the teacher as a reflective practitioner?
Sure, yeah. I mean, what I was, it's quite, I suppose when we think about reflection, what are we thinking about? We're thinking about a teacher who is thoughtful, a teacher who has time in her day to think about what it is she's doing and time to talk to others about that as well, yeah? And also has probably in her formation, in her teacher education, has been given the tools with which to do that reflection and has had access to theory, yeah, because you need to have something to reflect with and to reflect on, yeah? So it seems to me that a model of the teacher, yeah, could be this kind of thoughtful, highly educated person who can reflect on what's going on in her school, in her classroom, etc., and make decisions about that. But this is also, as my old colleague at the Institute, Bob Cowan, said, a very dangerous model of the teacher. Yeah, I mean, he was in favor of it, but he says it's dangerous because it can mean that the teacher gets to get ideas about herself being more important than she really is. Yeah. Now, if we look at, I'm going to draw on the British experience here, but it may well be the same in Argentina. It's certainly been the same in other parts of the world. But one of the things that happened across the neoliberal period is the nature of teacher education has changed dramatically. And what's sometimes called, or what Cowan called, the knowledge fit for teachers has been reduced and simplified, so that the teacher today in the UK is someone who is capable of delivering the national curriculum, someone who can deliver product, and that's it. Yeah. Now, you could argue that that's a very limited view of the teacher. Yeah. What we want is a teacher who is actually more reflective, who can make decisions, who can think about things and say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to spend more time on this, less time on that, etc. Yeah. And tailor what she's teaching to the students in the school that she's working in. I think an effective practitioner is a teacher who is more of a technician, who operationalizes things and delivers product efficiently and can test it effectively. Whereas the reflective practitioner is probably a messier kind of teacher, but has a bigger picture in her mind when she's thinking about her job and what it is she's doing. Yeah. So I would see the effective practitioner as a teacher that's very closely aligned to a kind of neoliberal regime, which is, after all, about producing citizens or producing people who can work in the capitalist economy. That's what you want. You want people that can fit in and do what needs to be done. Yeah. The reflective practitioner might be producing a different kind of citizen, maybe one who is more thoughtful, who is more critical of the status quo, and not such a neat fit really when it comes to servicing the economy. Yeah.
Yes, and there is not much room for CSC topics in the case of the effective practitioner who delivers a certain curriculum. Okay. Moving on to a more practice-oriented question. We know that there are different approaches to dealing with, for example, LGBTQ issues or heteronormativity in our classrooms as teachers. And one of these approaches is the discourse inquiry approach, which Cynthia Nelson, somebody you quote in your papers, argues that is the most effective with language learners. What does this approach involve, and how can we teachers implement it in our classrooms, especially with A2 learners or learners who might not have the language proficiency required, for example, to get involved in debates or in discussing issues?
I mean, again, that's a very good question, Para. And I have to be honest with you. I mean, I was a classroom teacher for quite a few years. I mean, I worked from 1984 until 1998 as a classroom teacher. But 1998 was a long time ago. And, you know, I do wonder about whether or not I'm entitled to speak to teachers about what it is they can do. But it seems to me that you can do some things, yeah, with A2 learners. For example, looking at very, you know, heteronormative advertising texts, for example, can be great ways of focusing on heteronorms, yeah. Looking at things that are overtly sexist, yeah, and then asking the students to think about maybe making, you know, another version of this, or remaking something that's not quite so demeaning of women. Like I remember years ago when I was a classroom teacher working with some teenagers in Barcelona, and we were looking at fairy stories, and we looked at Cinderella, yeah, or maybe it was Little Red Riding Hood. I can't remember. It was Little Red Riding Hood, and there was a thing then called girl power, which was like coming from the Spice Girls. So I got them to rewrite the story of Little Red Riding Hood from a sort of a girl power perspective, yeah. And the kids really got into it, and they produced a completely different kind of narrative, yeah. So I think, you know, playing with things, looking at advertising texts, maybe playing with stories that they're familiar with, looking at the family even, you know, just looking at a very, you know, the way in which the family is represented, you know, in a textbook, you know, at elementary level is often, you know, mother, father, son, daughter, you know, and you say, well, hold on a minute, are all families like this? What other kinds of family are there? What about the family with just a mother, you know, and no father, you know? Or what about, you know, the family where the people who are caring for the child are the grandparents, you know? So maybe getting kids to look at other kinds of families and sort of, you know, then drawing their family and things like that. You know, I think you can do things at that level. And what you're doing there is critiquing in a very kind of gentle way the representational practice that's being delivered in the textbook, yeah, but without turning it into some great big scary thing about critiquing the family or something like that. But I think just gently unpicking things and showing, you know, kids that there are other ways that are also legitimate and perfectly acceptable, you know. I mean, I remember talking to some Brazilian teachers, and this woman showed me this wonderful, it was for very young learners. It was a little picture book, but it had all kinds of different families in it, you know. And this was for use with very small children. And I think it was it was maybe learning English actually. But there were so many different kinds of families in it that you realize that the book was like a little, it was like a little grenade or a bomb. It was just blowing up the idea of this very traditional mother, father, two children kind of nuclear thing, you know. So I think, you know, with a little bit of, you can just look at, you know, your textbook, look at what's there, and then invite students to think about alternative ways of representing that, drawing, if not necessarily on their own family, on other things that they're familiar with. Yeah, yeah.
Good. Yeah, you might be speaking about 𝑡ℎ𝑖𝑛𝑘's book, the family book.
I might be. What was that book called?
𝑡ℎ𝑖𝑛𝑘's book, the family book, which includes lots of diverse families. Yes, it's very interesting, and it's for little children. The language is very simple. Yes. Probably it was that one. Yeah. So we've been talking about these.
The other thing, I think, something that I'm interested in the book is using literature texts as a way into all of that. Looking at texts produced by queer writers, and seeing how they encode the world, and getting your learners to think about, you know, other ways of seeing things, other ways of feeling, looking at point of view. Imagine you're a character in the story, you know, what do you feel, what do you think, etc. And, you know, learners are often quite willing to role play and get into these things and to imagine various things. So I think literary text can be very helpful as well. Yeah.
Definitely. Yes, definitely. Yes. We've been talking about these issues for quite a long time now. And as you said before, there is legislation which affects the rights and lives of LGBTQ people. But we still feel that these are baby steps. And teacher education is key in this respect. So teachers are rights grantors, and being ourselves teacher educators, can you give us some advice on how to equip future teachers with the knowledge and skills that are necessary to address these issues in their classes?
Well, to be honest with you, I mean, you're absolutely right. I think that's where the change has to come from. I mean, if you'd asked me about this 20 years ago, I would have said, we need to be, as teachers, we need to begin to, put pressure on the publishers. We need to see different kinds of pedagogical material being produced, etc. But in fact, as you say, we've been talking about this for a very long time. I don't know if we're going to get anywhere petitioning publishers. I think we still need to make noise, and maybe things can begin to happen. But I think teacher education programs themselves need to start including sessions on, how do we deal with diversity in our teaching, yeah, and find out what, get people to talk about it, build it into the course, yeah. Like, for example, when I think about the initial teacher education programs in the institution that I work in, usually somebody like me is invited to come along and maybe do one session on LGBTQ stuff, yeah? So I think beginning to design our teacher education programs with a focus somewhere in the program on that very issue is in itself the beginning of something, because people will then see that, this is being recognized as important by this institution or by this body that is giving me this qualification to become a teacher. So I think beginning to actively, as teacher educators, incorporate it into our curriculum, then we begin to transmit to teachers the importance of them doing it when they get into a classroom. Yeah. And I suppose and then of course through continuing professional development as well, working with schools, working with teachers who have been teaching maybe for ages and haven't done these things. So I think, but just prioritizing it and making sure that it's built into what we do, yeah, yes, I think is the way to go.
Yes, to deal with this in a more systematic way.
Exactly.
From time to time. Okay.
But it sounds like you guys are doing that. I mean, it sounds like that's what's beginning to happen.
Yes. Fortunately, the CSC law here backs us up in this respect. Well, to finish, because we don't want to take up much more of your time, can you tell us how, in your opinion, everything that we have discussed today contributes to social justice?
Well, I suppose, hello?
Yeah.
You still there?
Yes.
Yes, we're here.
No, I did something to my screen and I made you disappear for a minute. I think it contributes to social justice if we start to, as you say, build this into our curriculum, into what we do as teacher educators and into what we do as teachers. I mean, as we do that, we will begin to make a difference to our students' lives. Yeah, those students who are, for example, LGBTQ will begin to see that they are being recognized as legitimate. I mean, I know people say like, oh, but it's everywhere. It's on the TV, it's in the cinema, but education is a hugely important domain for legitimizing things. And by being at the heart of education, we're sending out a very important signal about the importance of this. Yeah. So I think as we begin to incorporate this, and as we begin to bring in those groups of people, not just LGBTQ people, but those groups that have been marginalized, yeah, then we begin to contribute towards the construction of a world in which social justice is seen as important. Yeah. So I think by showing that it's important, we automatically begin to build towards a more socially just world. That would be my take on it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's all about doing something, not just reading about it. I mean, reading is a good starting point, but definitely we need to act on what we are reading and what we want to change. I mean, if we want to change something, we need to do something better. Definitely. Okay, thank you very much. I mean, we've been listening to you. I mean, thank you for sharing your knowledge, your time with us.
No, not at all. It's an absolute pleasure talking to you, you know, but it sounds like you're ahead of the game, you know, you're doing good things, you know.
We're trying. We are trying.
Good luck with all of that, you know.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank you very much for sharing everything with us.
Pleasure.
Okay.
Okay, enjoy the rest of the. It's not summer there, but enjoy the. Well,
winter.
It's winter here. It's very cold.
Okay.
Gray outside.
All right. It's like that here as well, actually, at the moment. Okay, well, hopefully the lockdown will end soon, and
Fingers crossed.
we'll all be back to a more normal life in not too long.
We hope so.
All right. Yeah, ciao.
Thank you. Bye.